Good morning. It's wonderful to see you all, to be in worship with you all this morning as we continue this season of waiting and anticipation that we call Advent. And if you're new here, my name's Zach. I'm one of the pastors here, along with Pastor Sue, who you heard from earlier. And I just want to say welcome. We're so glad you're here with us this morning. This morning we're continuing this Advent series we've been going through the last few weeks called Genealogy of God, which is maybe a strange Advent series a little bit because we're not really looking at the Christmas story, or at least not in the way that we're used to, right? We know the big story. Even if you don't consider yourself a Christian, you probably know the story. I'm fairly confident that you know the story, at least enough of it. You know the highlights. An angel came to Mary and said that despite the fact that she was a virgin, she would be having a baby, and the baby would be the Son of God. And then her and Joseph, they head off to Bethlehem to report for the census that's being conducted, and the baby comes, and they search for a place to have the baby, and there's no room at the end, so they go to a barn and have the baby and lay it in a manger. And then angels sing to shepherds, and stars speak to wise men, and they show up with gifts, and boom, there's the Christmas story. At least as we know it. The story as our culture knows it. It's this kind of very isolated incident in time. But Matthew does something interesting in the gospel he wrote. He doesn't start with that birth. He starts by telling us, no. This isn't just an isolated incident. It's not just an isolated story. This has been in the works for generations. And he lists those generations, 41 generations, all pointing towards the birth of Christ. And what's interesting about that list is that when these lists are formed, the focus is usually on the men in the family. But he does something different, something that people in that time wouldn't do. He lists 5 women. He highlights 5 women, and not the women you would expect to hear about in the line of Jesus. These are women whose lives are filled with tragedy and some scandal. And there they are. And so what we're doing with this Advent series is looking at these 5 women and seeing how these women point to their great-great-great-grandson and how ridiculously, radically, and recklessly inclusive God is when it comes to his family. 2 weeks ago, we looked at the story of Tamar and how God's family welcomes those who have been cast out. Last week, we looked at Rahab and how God's family welcomes those who have been outside the whole time. And this week, we're looking at the story of Naomi and Ruth and how God's family welcomes the broken. And the story is about 4 chapters long, so we're gonna read the highlights of the story, and I'll try to fill in the gaps for you as we read it. But it's from the book of Ruth, which starts on page 374. If you're using a Bible from the pew, that's page 374. We're going to start at verse 11 in chapter 1, but I'll set it up quick while you're searching for it. The story opens on a woman named Naomi and her family. She has a husband and 2 boys, and there's a famine in the land of Israel, so they flee to the land of Moab. And while they're there, Naomi's husband dies, and her 2 sons get married, but they also die. And she's left with just 2 daughters-in-law. And so Naomi hears that this famine in Israel that sent them into Moab, the famine is over, and so she decides that she's going to go head back to Israel, and she goes and tells her daughters-in-law, and this is what follows. Verse 11. But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me. Even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand is turned against me." At this, they wept aloud. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. We'll pause there. Ruth shows tremendous loyalty to Naomi in this moment, and then they head off to Israel. And when they get there, Naomi instructs these people who are greeting her. She says, don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara, because that word means bitter, which makes sense. Naomi means pleasant, and her life isn't very pleasant at this moment. Just lost her husband and both sons. It makes sense that she's feeling a little more on the bitter side, which I think is something that we can relate to. Maybe not in that extent of mourning. Maybe it is for you. But sometimes life is full and pleasant, but life can also be empty and bitter. We lost a job that provided a nice house and new cars, and now we're left with an empty bank account. Or the future dreams that were brimming over have now gotten dumped and scraped out, and our cup is empty. There's an empty seat at the table that matches that empty place in our heart. Sometimes we're Mara, bitter, because we've been brought back empty. And now Naomi or Mara and Ruth, they walk into Bethlehem empty. But they walk into a land that is guided by the Lord's rule. And the Lord watches over those who are vulnerable. In Israel, God had established this law where he tells the farmers, you should not harvest all of your crops. You should leave at least a little bit so that the poor and the foreigner can come and take from your crops and still be fed despite not having the money to be fed. This is called gleaning. And so Naomi tells Ruth that she has a relative named Boaz, and Ruth should go to his farm and glean behind the workers and bring home some grain for the two of them. Now Boaz sees her doing this, and he asks about her, and then he goes and speaks to her. And this is what we have in chapter 2, verse 8. We'll pick up there. So Boaz says to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. At this, she bowed down her face to the ground. She asked him, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. How you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord, she said. You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have standing of one of your servants. Boaz shows kindness to Ruth. He shows her chesed, that word we talked about last week, the steadfast, loving kindness of the Lord. He ends up sitting down with her for a meal, and he gives her permission to glean all day, and he even instructs his own harvesters to go and help her. She ends up walking home with about 22 liters of grain. And when Ruth comes home and shows Naomi, she's thrilled. And she tells Ruth something that's important and that we'll get to in a moment. She tells Ruth that Boaz is one of her kinsman redeemers. We continue, chapter 3, verse 1. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, my daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. Basically what Naomi's doing here is telling Ruth to go and present herself as a potential wife to Boaz. And she does. She does exactly what Ruth instructs her to do. And since Boaz is this kinsman redeemer, he has the opportunity to take Ruth as a wife. But not just that, but to receive her farmland that was entrusted to Ruth's husband, Elimelech, or Naomi's husband, Elimelech. It seems like a great deal for him. There's just one problem. Boaz isn't the next one in line. There's one other that comes before him that should get this opportunity before him. So Boaz goes and meets with this first priority kinsman redeemer, the one who's first in line. Chapter 4, verse 1. Meanwhile, Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there, just as the kinsman redeemer he had mentioned came along. Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So we went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here," and they did so. Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so, but if you will not tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line. I will redeem it, he said. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. At this, the kinsman redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." Looks like the deal of a lifetime. He gets the girl and he gets the land. There's just one problem. The land wouldn't actually belong to him. We talked about this, about something similar a few weeks earlier when we talked about Tamar, right? When Tamar's husband dies without an heir, it's his brother who's required to provide Tamar with a child so that child could receive the inheritance that Tamar's first husband would receive. The child wouldn't legally be a child of the person who actually fathered the child. They would be the child of the first husband and receive that inheritance, which that's what it means to be a kinsman redeemer. You redeem the household of your kin. So what it means for Ruth and this first kinsman redeemer is that if they were to have a son, the land would no longer be the kinsman redeemer's. It would pass to Ruth's son, who would legally be the son of her first husband, who died in Moab. Does that make sense? I just threw a whole bunch of stuff at you. So, okay. Basically, the kinsman redeemer sees that whole situation and probably what you all would do also after I just told you what that situation was. It said, "That's so much, I don't want to deal with that." And he passes on the responsibility to marry Ruth, which leaves Boaz the next in line. And he does what the first kinsman redeemer refuses to do. He accepts Ruth as his responsibility, and he redeems her and the land. Boaz obligated himself to farm land that wouldn't ultimately be brought into the estate under his name. He also chose to bear offspring that will continue the inheritance line of Ruth's first husband, not his. And this all means that at great cost to himself, by buying the land and taking Ruth as his wife, Boaz redeemed Naomi from her empty estate. He continued her line. He bought back her land. He took her from barren poverty and filled her with food and a future inheritance. See, notice a few verses later, we read that the women of, we're not going to read it, but we read that the women of Bethlehem speak again to Naomi and say that it's Naomi who has this son, even though it's Ruth who bears the child. It's Naomi's whose future and lineage is restored to her. This baby boy born in Bethlehem becomes a kinsman redeemer for her because his life reestablishes her estate. I want to point out a couple things of the story. I know we didn't read the whole thing, but if you did, you'd notice something. God isn't really mentioned here. There's a few promises and blessings pronounced in his name, but he's not mentioned as doing anything in the story. His name is there a few times, but he's not very active. But yet it's so clear that the Lord is active throughout. The way that he provides for Naomi and Ruth, the way he aligns everything into place so that Naomi can experience that redemption. It's clear that even in the moments of deepest bitterness, God was at work. Whether or not Naomi and Ruth could feel it at that time, he was pulling the strings. He was working things and pulling them together for the redemption of his daughters. That's not just true for Naomi and Ruth. It's true for you and me. In the moments of deepest bitterness, in the moments that we have no idea where God even is, we can trust that he's at work, that he's not going to leave us where we're at, that he hasn't abandoned us, that when we feel empty, when we're in pain, when we're bitter, he's there in the midst of the mess with us. He hasn't abandoned us. I mean, it's the reason we celebrate Christmas, right? Emmanuel, God with us. It's the day that God came into our mess and decided to make his home there. In the middle of your mess, in the middle of your bitterness, God hasn't left you. And sometimes it takes hindsight to notice. Sometimes you need to see the big picture, which is frustrating. I get it. But God didn't abandon Naomi. He didn't abandon Ruth. And we see his hand throughout this book, throughout this story. And God hasn't abandoned you. He is active. He is moving. He is with you. Second, the story of Ruth and Naomi and Boaz comes at kind of a weird place in the Bible. The order of it seems weird. If you're reading through the Bible from front to back, it may seem strange. You go from the book of Judges and all these kind of grand epic tales of heroes' rises and downfalls, and then you have this story of a widowed woman and a man who redeems their family. And then you go on to the book of David, where you get like David and Goliath and all these wars and battles and him fighting with Saul. It's strange, this kind of like detour. And it's easy to read the book of Ruth as this individual separate story before going back into the narrative of the Old Testament. But it's all connected. The book of Judges, the book that's right before Ruth, it ends with this sentence. It says, "In those days Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit." Implying that Israel needs a king. I love the dimensions to this story. You see Ruth and Naomi, they need a redeemer, and then along comes Boaz to redeem them. Israel needs a redeemer. They need a leader. They need a king. And it's through that line, through Boaz and Ruth's children, that they receive one. We read that they have a son, and they name him Obed. Obed has a son named Jesse, and then Jesse has a son that we've probably all have heard of. His name's David, who one day would become Israel's greatest king. But what's even greater is the story of redemption hints not just at Ruth's great-grandson. It hints at her great-great-great-great-great-grandson. At what he would do. This book, it's only 40 or 85 verses long. And the word redeemed shows up 23 times. The story is not just about Ruth's redemption. It's not just about Israel's redemption. It's about our redemption. Ruth's story is pointing forward to the ultimate kinsman redeemer, Jesus Christ, who, because he became a human, he became one of our kin. And because he went to the cross, he became a redeemer. Boaz sacrificed a part of himself to provide for Naomi and her future. Jesus sacrificed his glorious riches in heaven. He emptied himself to join us in our emptiness, in our bitterness. He became obedient to death in order to fill us with life and give us an eternal future. He gave up everything to redeem us. Naomi received a grandson who reestablished her household. God gave up his son in order to bring us into his household. Hope for Naomi rested in the future she saw in that little baby boy. She rested in the hope that she would be taken care of and her family would continue into the future. But the hope that the Lord provides us in Jesus is the ultimate hope. It's not just the hope that death and all the brokenness and despair that come with it will be managed with offspring and food. It's the hope that death and all of the emptiness with it will be done away for good. It's the hope seen in Jesus who sacrificially went down into the depths of emptiness for our sake, and he was raised full of life. It's a living hope. It's the hope of resurrection and ultimate redemption. So friends, if you take away anything from this sermon, this is the time to listen if you've checked out, okay? I hope it's this. If you take away anything, I hope it's this. Ruth is someone who brought really nothing to the table. She had no money. She had no family apart from Naomi. She brought nothing but faith and loyalty to Naomi and to Boaz. And through that, she received more than she ever could have thought possible for a widowed outsider, for someone as broken as she was. Now, friends, I say this in the most loving way possible. You don't bring anything to the table that God needs. He's not impressed by your good looks or your strength or your ability or your obedience or the size of your wallet or how good you can sing or how beautifully you can pray. No. He doesn't love you because of anything you do or don't do. He loves you because through faith, you're part of his family. And as part of his family, he invites you to bring your nothing and receive a life filled. Receive everything. Jesus tells us in John 10:10, he says, I have come so that you may have life and have it to the full. This meal in front of us is a reminder of that. Jesus, who was born in the city of David, called Bethlehem, which means house of bread. He also said, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and he who believes in me will never go thirsty. He's the only one that can truly fill us. He's the only one who can truly heal what's broken. We remember and celebrate during the season of Advent that he's come and he's emptied himself in order to bring us, the broken and the poor, the bitter, to bring us into his family and seat us at his table. So this morning we're going to eat this meal as part of that family together.